You can't buy me to make me stay.
Watch me do it.
The night I met the third richest man in South Korea, I was standing in the middle of Coldwater Canyon in 6-inch heels, holding a shoe in one hand and a bag of chips in the other, screaming at a Waymo that had just left me stranded on the side of a road with no sidewalk, no streetlights, and apparently no cell signal. That's the whole first 30 seconds of how my life changed. Not a meet cute at a coffee shop, not a charming stumble into his arms at a gala. A self-driving car dumped me on a hill in Bel Air because my card declined for a ride I'd already paid for, and I was standing there in one of my best dress, eating chips out of spite, when a luxury car worth more than my mother's house rolled to a stop beside me. My name is Athena Tucker. You've probably never heard that name in your life, but if I told you I go by the name Angel, if I told you I was the girl who played Nadia in the movie Palisades, the one who cried in the rain scene that got 17 million views on its own, you'd know exactly who I was. That's the funny thing about being famous. Everyone knows my face. Nobody knows my name. I like it that way. Keeps things clean and personal. Anyway, back to the hill. The car that stopped was black, low, and looked like it had been poured rather than built. The window came down in total silence, like the car itself was embarrassed to be seen idling next to a woman eating fast food on the side of a canyon road. "You're standing in the middle of a blind curve," a masculine voice said. It was a rich baritone, but it sounded unbothered and faintly amused. And underneath the amusement, he had an accent that pronounced words a little differently. "I'm aware," I said, not looking at him yet, because I was busy trying to get my other shoe back on while balancing on one foot like a flamingo having a nervous breakdown. "I'm also aware that I'm about to be roadkill, so if you could just, I don't know, not run me over, that would be great." I wasn't planning to. Bold of you to have a plan at all up here. Must be such a privilege. That got a good laugh out of him. It was low, and it sounded like he was surprised, like he hadn't meant to give in to laughter. I finally looked up. "Dear friend, and yes, I'm calling you my dear friend now, because if my story teaches you anything, it's that a girl needs someone to talk to when her whole world flips upside down in the span of one canyon road. I need you to understand what I was looking at." He looked like someone had commissioned a god, gotten impatient with the wait, and just carved him into a human out of marble and warm brown sugar instead. Jet black hair, cut close on the sides, and just long enough on top to look like he'd raked a hand through it and not cared. A jaw you could set a level against. Skin like he spent his mornings doing something outdoorsy and expensive, sailing, maybe, or beating grown men at golf. He was wearing a black button-down with the sleeves shoved up to his elbows, and forearms that had no business being that distracting on a man who was, at that exact moment, supposed to be helping me not die on a public road. "You're gawking at me," he said. "Well, you're blocking traffic," I shot back, though there was no traffic. In fact, there was no traffic because we were the only two idiots on this hill at 11 at night. "Get in the car." "Sorry, I don't get in cars with strange men." "I'm not strange, I'm Aiden." "That just tells me your name, not your character." Something flickered across his face, not annoyance, more like interest. Like I'd said something he didn't hear very often from people who weren't currently trying to get something from him. Which, considering the car, the luxury watch I could see glinting on his wrist even in the dark, and his general aura of an alpha male who owned buildings for fun, was probably most people. "Fair enough," he said slowly. "Then let me earn it. Where are you going?" "No way you're driving. I had a car, it just left." Because my card declined, which is a whole separate humiliation that I don't need to unpack with a stranger on a hill. Thank you. He studied me for a second too long, the way people do when they're doing math on you: age, job, story, exit strategy. I braced for the moment he'd recognize me. It happens sometimes, mostly with people who have seen Palisades 17 times and cry-quote the rain scene at me in Trader Joe's. But nothing shifted in his face. No spark of recognition. Just a man looking at a woman standing in the dark holding a shoe and a chips bag like it was the most normal day of his life. "I'll take you where you're going," he said. "No card required." "And what's the catch?" "No catch." There's always a catch with men who drive cars like yours. He smiled then, and I want you to understand something. I have been on sets with the most beautiful men Hollywood has manufactured. I have kissed several of them, professionally, under hot lights, for money. None of them smiled like that. None of them made my stomach drop the way it did when this handsome stranger's whole face rearranged itself into something wicked and warm at the same time. The catch, he said, is that you're going to tell me your name before we get to wherever we're going. Angel, I said automatically, more like a reflex or an armor. That's not a real name. I could sense it. I blinked. Nobody had ever called that out to my face, not even people who knew me. Fine, I said, sliding into a car that smelled like cedar and money. Athena. Athena, he repeated like he was testing the weight of it. Goddess of wisdom, strategy, war. And you're going to tell me you're a god too. Let me guess. Money. Close. He pulled smoothly onto the road, and I felt the car answer him like it had been waiting all night for a reason to move. Aiden Minjun. The name landed somewhere in the back of my brain and rang a very small, very distant bell. The kind of bell that goes off when you've seen a name in a headline you scrolled past without really reading. I didn't place it. Not yet. Well, Aiden Minjun, I said, kicking off my shoes properly and curling my feet under me like I own the seat. You have exactly 20 minutes to convince me you're not a serial killer before we get to my apartment. I don't need to convince you of anything, he said, glancing at me sideways, that same wicked warmth still sitting in the corner of his mouth. I already know you're going to say yes to whatever request I ask you next. Try me. He didn't answer right away. He just drove, city lights sliding gold and white across the windshield, and let the silence stretch until it started to feel like its own kind of question. Well, I have a problem, he finally said, and I think you might be exactly the solution I didn't know I was looking for. And that is how a stranded actress with a declined card and a bag of chips ended up in the passenger seat of a Korean billionaire's car, with absolutely no idea that in 6 months she'd be wearing a ring worth more than every paycheck she'd ever earned, standing in a penthouse in Seoul, falling in love with a man who was about to turn her whole life into something out of a fairy tale with golden teeth. He had a problem, and I was about to become the most expensive solution of his life. Aiden didn't take me home. Well, he did, eventually. But first, he took me to a rooftop restaurant in West Hollywood that I didn't even know existed, the kind of place with no sign out front, just a discreet elevator, and a man in a suit who nodded at Aiden like he was greeting a member of the family. I already had chips, I reminded him as we sat down at a table overlooking the entire glittering sprawl of the city. I don't need a full-course dinner. You need better food, he said, and ordered wine with a name I couldn't pronounce and a steak I definitely couldn't afford. And somewhere between the second course and the moment the city lights started blurring gold at the edges of my vision, I stopped being scared of him and started being something more unlike me. I was curious about him. So, I said, this problem of yours. He leaned back, loosening his collar with 2 fingers in a way that should not have been that distracting. I run a company. Several companies, technically, but the one that matters this week is Han Min Group. We're closing an acquisition in Los Angeles, an American media conglomerate. The deal has been 18 months in the making. Congratulations, still not seeing where I come in. The man on the other side of the table, Richard Calloway, is old money, old-fashioned. He does not trust a bachelor. He trusts family men. He said something about showing stability, roots, stupid stuff like that. Aiden's jaw ticked just slightly, the first crack I'd seen in the marble. He has made it clear more than once that he's uneasy signing a deal of this size with a man who has no partner, no ring, no photographs of a life outside a boardroom. So get a partner then. That's what I'm asking you to be, for 10 days. I nearly choked on my wine. Wait, you want to pay me to be your fake girlfriend? I want to pay you to be my date. To galas, dinners, one very tedious opera fundraiser, and a weekend in Seoul to meet my family, who will ask questions, and you will need convincing answers. We will need to make it convincing enough to everyone, just in case he hires a private investigator. He said it so plainly, like he was reading me a grocery list. In exchange, I will pay you $200,000, cover all expenses, and you keep anything I buy you along the way." The number sat in the air between us, like its own kind of centerpiece. Now, let me be honest with you, dear friend, because I promised myself I would be honest in telling this part of my story. I am not a woman who needed saving. I had a career. I had 3 magazine covers and a Netflix deal in negotiations. I was not poor. But acting is a feast or famine business, and I was 6 weeks into a famine. My card had just declined on a $9 ride. I don't know the reason yet, but I will figure it out. But $200,000 for 10 days of wearing pretty dresses and holding a gorgeous man's hand sounded less like exploitation and more like the best paid vacation of my entire life. You have to understand where I came from to understand why that number made my hands shake under the table. I grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment in Inglewood with my mother, who ran a hair salon out of our converted garage for 11 years before she could afford an actual storefront, and my younger brother, Elijah, who was, at the time of this story, 3 semesters into a nursing program and 2 semesters away from having to drop out if he didn't find more financial aid. My father wasn't in the picture, hadn't been since I was 9, and my mother had built an entire life for the 3 of us out of sheer stubbornness and a business degree she earned taking night classes while I did homework on the floor of her salon, surrounded by the smell of relaxer and the sound of women gossiping about men who didn't deserve them. I booked my first commercial at 16. A local furniture store, $40 an hour, and I remember handing my mother the check and watching her cry over a couch commercial like I'd restored her hope. By 19, I'd changed my name to Angel for auditions, because casting directors kept mispronouncing Athena, and somewhere in the years since, Angel had become so much bigger than Athena that most rooms I walked into had genuinely forgotten the second name existed. Even my own agent sometimes forgot to use it. So when a handsome man with an intense gaze that should be illegal offered me $200,000 to hold his hand for 10 days, I took it not because I was in rock bottom, but I did it on impulse. I had no idea just now that my impulsive decision would come with the best sex, the best laughter, and the most devastatingly handsome man I had ever met, attached completely free of charge, all in one package. "I have conditions," I said slowly. Something in his expression shifted, not surprise exactly. It looked like he'd been hoping I'd say that. "Name them." 300,000, not 2. 250. 3, or I go back to eating my chips and minding my business in peace. He studied me for a long moment, and then slowly, like he was processing something he liked, he smiled. 300,000, done. I have a job, a real one. I'm shooting a film in 6 weeks. I need to be back for the first scene. You'll be back, I promise. No cameras of me without my consent. I have a public image to protect, and it is not the image of a woman who takes money to play pretend. Agreed, though for what it's worth, he said, tilting his head. I don't think of it as playing pretend. I think of it as a very well-compensated performance. You are an actress, are you not? I froze. How did you? I didn't until just now. His smile turned sharper, more satisfied. You just told me. Damn him. Fine, I said, refusing to give him the satisfaction of looking rattled. One more condition. If at any point I decide I've had enough, I walk. No argument, no guilt trip, no lawyers. I walk, and I keep whatever I've earned up to that point. Agreed. He extended his hand across the table. Do we have a deal, Athena? I looked at that hand for a long moment. They were strong and steady. The kind of hand that had clearly never had to ask twice for anything in its life. I shook it anyway. We have a deal, Aiden Minjan. His fingers stayed wrapped around mine a beat longer than a handshake required. Then, let's start tomorrow. I'll send a car at 9. A car that won't abandon me on a hillside this time, I joked. I promise you, he said low, everything in your life from this point forward is going to be considerably smoother. He had no idea how wrong he was, or how right, honestly both. $300,000, 10 days, one devastatingly handsome billionaire. What could possibly go wrong? I did not sign anything that first night. Contrary to what every romance novel has ever taught you, No sane woman signs a 14-page legal document on the hood of a stranger's imagination tax car after one dinner. I went home, I peeled off the borrowed evening confidence like a costume, and I called my agent, Priya, at 11:40 at night. Because Priya answers calls at 11:40 at night the same way emergency room doctors answer pagers. Like it's simply part of the job description she signed up for. He wants to pay you $300,000 to be his fake girlfriend for 10 days, Priya repeated back to me, very slowly, the way you'd repeat something to make sure you hadn't misheard it in a language you barely spoke. Correct. Aiden Minjun, as in Hanmin Group Aiden Minjun, as in the man Forbes called the most eligible bachelor in Asia and quite possibly the rudest interview I have ever conducted, Aiden Minjun. You read that article too. Everyone read that article, Athena. It went viral for the sheer audacity of him telling a Forbes reporter that her question about his ideal woman was a lady with very high IQ, definitely not someone dumb like her. I could hear Priya packing on the other end, the click of her heels against hardwood, the sound of a woman doing risk assessment in real time. Okay, this could be good for you, visibility, the right kind of visibility, not the messy kind. But Athena, I need you to be smart about this. Get everything in writing, every single thing. I plan to. And Athena, she paused, and I heard something soften in her voice, something that had nothing to do with contracts or visibility. Is this actually about the money? You don't have to pretend with me. I sat on the edge of my bed, the light from my ring light still glowing faintly in the corner where I'd left it on after a self-tape earlier that day, and told her the truth. It's not really about the money, although money is a good motivation, yeah. But Priya, he found me and rescued me on the side of a road while I was eating cold chips and having the worst night of my month. I don't know what that's about yet. I just know I want to find out and enjoy the experience as well. Fair enough, she said. Enjoy the experience and call your mother. Tell her about him before the tabloids do. My mother took the news the way my mother takes everything, with the exact right amount of shock, followed almost instantly by extreme maternal interrogation. A billionaire, she said, in the tone she usually reserved for finding out I'd booked a role that required me to cry on command for 6 hours straight. A Korean billionaire. Baby, is he handsome? Mama, I'm asking a valid question. If I'm about to see my daughter's face plastered next to some man's on the cover of a magazine, I need to know if I should be proud or if I need to fly out there and start fighting for you. I searched for a word big enough. He looks like somebody asked God for a favor and God actually delivered for once. My mother laughed, that big, warm, unguarded laugh that had gotten her through 11 years of a garage salon and one absent husband and 2 kids she'd raised entirely alone. Well, all right then. $300,000 and a face carved by the Lord himself. Baby, sign the papers. You're supposed to tell me to be careful. I raised you to be careful, Athena Renee Tucker. I don't need to remind a grown, careful woman to be careful. I just need to remind her that she deserves nice things too, every once in a while, and this sounds like a very nice thing. She paused, then her voice softened. Be careful, sweetheart. Don't do what you wouldn't be proud of. I'll be careful. I promise. I nodded slowly, understanding her unsaid words and assuring her that she raised me right, and I wasn't going to discard my home training just because a billionaire offered me a deal. I know you will be careful, baby. You always do. I hung up the phone with my chest tight in that particular way it always got when I thought about how much of my life had been built on the phrase, you always do. And how nice. How genuinely, dizzyingly nice. It felt to being told that, for once, in a situation that involves a man who looked at me like I was the only interesting human he'd ever met in a room full of other people. The car came at 9, exactly like he said it would, except it wasn't just a car. It was a driver named Hyun Woo who handed me a tablet the moment I sat down, already loaded with a document titled, without a hint of irony, companionship, and public appearance agreement. 14 pages, in English and Korean, with a payment schedule that made my eyes water in the best way, a confidentiality clause, an itemized list of the public appearances I'd be expected to attend, including, I noted with real alarm, something called the Hanmin Foundation Gala, which required, and I quote, formal evening where befitting the Hanmin name, and buried on page 11, a clause about physical affection. Hand-holding, embracing, and kissing may be required for the believability of the arrangement, at a level mutually agreed upon by both parties, and nothing beyond what either party consents to at the moment. I read that line 4 times. By the time the car pulled up to the Hanmin Group's Lowe's Angels office, a glass tower on Wilshire that looked like it had personally blown the minds of several architecture critics for being too beautiful, I had signed my name at the bottom of every page, and I was equal parts thrilled and terrified about what I'd just agreed to. Aiden was waiting in the lobby, and I want to tell you I thought I was mentally prepared to see how he'd look in a suit, but it turns out I was not. I have to confess and admit that I was profoundly, catastrophically not prepared. Midnight black suit, cut so close to his body it looked less like clothing and more like a threat. No tie. Top button of a black shirt underneath, undone. He was on the phone, speaking rapid, clipped Korean to someone, and the second he saw me walk in, he ended the call mid-sentence like whoever was on the other end had simply ceased to matter. "You signed," he said, walking toward me. "Yes," I nodded. "I signed the contract." "Good." He looked me up and down in a way that made my skin warm up under his intense gaze. "Your hair is magnificent. I think I love it more when you let it flow free. But you need clothes." "Excuse me." "It's not an insult." He gestured at my outfit, jeans, a white crop tee, the kind of casually thrown together look I'd worn to 100 auditions. "You look beautiful, but the events on this schedule require a different kind of beautiful. I've cleared the afternoon." "Wait, you cleared an entire afternoon of running a billion-dollar acquisition just to take me shopping?" I asked with a raised eyebrow, feeling a bit suspicious and wondering what he was up to. "I cleared an entire afternoon," he said, gently guiding me back toward the car with a hand at the small of my back that I felt straight through my shirt. "Because the boutiques on Rodeo drive close at 7, and I intend for you to try on every single thing that catches your eye before then." I laughed, a little disbelieving. "You know most men would kill to get out of shopping, right?" "I'm not most men." And dear friend, he absolutely was not like most men. The first boutique we walked into, a woman in a designer outfit looked me up and down with the particular chill of someone deciding I did not belong in her store. I'd seen that look 100 times before fame, and honestly a few times since I got famous, especially on days I didn't feel like doing my hair. I mentally braced for the usual, the slow blink, the "our dresses are currently not on sales," that's usually delivered like an accusation. She didn't even get the sentence out. "Get her everything," Aiden said, before she could speak, sliding a black card across the counter like a king laying down a decree. "Whatever she wants, whatever she looks at twice. Bring her the nice things you think she would love, even the ones she didn't ask for." The woman's whole posture changed so fast, I nearly felt bad for her. By the fourth store, word had apparently traveled, because they started sending champagne before we even sat down, and a rack of dresses was already waiting, curated, in my exact size, before I'd said a word. I will not pretend that I didn't enjoy every single second of it. Some romance stories will tell you the heroine feels guilty about the gifts, uneasy about the money, desperate to prove she's not that kind of girl. Well, I'm here to tell you I'm that type of girl. I like luxury, and I'm very intentional about living soft life. I tried on a gold silk gown with a price tag that cost more than my first car, and when I stepped out of the fitting room, Aiden looked up from his phone and just stopped. He looked like he stopped breathing, for a second, if I'm being generous with myself. I felt like the most powerful woman alive. "That one," he said, his voice coming out rough in a way that sent shivers down my spine. "You haven't seen the other 4 I picked out." "I don't need to. This dress you've got on is perfect." "What if I want to keep looking?" He crossed the room slowly and stopped close enough that I had to tilt my chin up to hold his gaze, close enough that I caught the low, warm scent of his cologne, cedar, something citrus underneath, something I'd be finding excuses to get close to him, so I can sniff him for the rest of my life. "Then look," he said. "I'll buy all 5. But I want you to know this one made it very difficult for me to breathe, and I'm supposed to be professional on our first day together. My whole body melted, like butter right there. Gosh, he had that much effect on me. Careful, Mr. Minjun, I said, glad that my voice came out steady against the fuzzy feelings spreading inside me. That almost sounded like a compliment. It was just an honest observation. His intense eyes locked on mine. I don't waste compliments on women I'm not trying to seduce. And are you trying to seduce me? Not yet, he winked at me, like he was up to something he wasn't ready to share yet. And the thought of him being all mysterious heightened the heat waves within me. I'm shocked I could still stand and talk. But he wasn't done. Instead, he continued with a smug smile. When I do, you'll know. We bought the gold dress, and the other 4 designer dresses that caught my eye. And if I'm honest, I spent that whole car ride back with my thighs pressed together, replaying his words like it was the only words I was interested in the English language. Okay, before we continue, can I ask you something real quick? I'm trying to figure out where people who love good stories are watching from. These days, are you team phone in bed, team laptop at work, or team living room TV? Drop a comment and let me know what team you are and where in the world you're watching this story from. I will personally reply to every single comment in the first hour. Hit that like and subscribe button. Now, let's proceed. That night, he took me to dinner at his house, since we've both agreed to begin our fake relationship. It's funny, the way I just said the word house, in the way a clueless person would have called the Pacific Ocean a puddle. Crazy, right? Well, his mansion sat up in the hills above sunset, all glass and dark wood and infinity edges that made the pool look like it poured straight off the mountain into the city below. There was a chef. There was a private elevator to a wine cellar. There was, somewhere in a back room I never got shown, apparently a movie room with seats better than the ones at the actual theater my movies premiered in. So, I said, sitting across from him at a table set for 2 on a terrace that overlooked half of Lowe's Angels. What does a Korean billionaire eat on a regular day? Let me guess, 24-karat gold flakes on everything. Kimchi jjigae, he said, casually, right as the chef set down 2 steaming bowls that smelled like heaven and looked like the least billionaire thing I'd seen all day. My grandmother's recipe. Don't tell my board of directors I still eat like this. It might ruin the image of accepting foreign cultures. I laughed really hard, the kind that comes out before you can stop it. It's crazy conjuring the mental image of a man like you, who controls empires eating just stew. I think you should see it as the image, he said, as he dipped his spoon into his dish. Of a man who was tired of people pretending to play nice, in order to get something or sell something to him. Something in the way he said it made me slowly put my own spoon down. Is that what today felt like? Is there supposed to be something for sale? He considered the question longer than I expected. No, he said finally. Today felt like the first time in longer than I'd like to admit that I wasn't thinking about a deal or a board or my father's expectations. I was thinking about which dress looked better on you and whether you'd laugh at my jokes, and I genuinely could not have told you, an hour later, how the Callaway negotiations were progressing, but I did anyway. I don't usually share that kind of information, and it's so unlike me. This new habit has never happened to me before. The honesty of it startled me more than I expected. You're supposed to be paying me to fake a relationship, I said quietly, not trying to figure out my dress choices or even have feelings about my dress in the first place. I'm aware of the irony. Is it going to be a problem? Only, he said, leaning forward, elbows on the table, eyes dark and steady on mine, if you don't feel it too. I should have lied. I should have laughed it off, kept things clean, kept the $300,000 uncomplicated by anything as messy as actual attraction. Instead, the words left my mouth before I could stop them. I felt it on the hill, before I even knew your name. The atmosphere between us immediately shifted into something else. The air itself seemed to get thicker, warmer, charged with sensual electricity that nearly messed with my morality and my brain. In that instant, without giving me enough time to regain my already crumpled self-dignity, he stood and rounded the table in a second, and I watched him move towards me, and strangely it felt like I was watching a storm roll in towards me. It felt inevitable, beautiful, a little terrifying all at the same time. "Athena," he said, low, testing my real name in his mouth the way he had in the car the night before, like he preferred it to the one the world knew me by. "Yes, I'm going to kiss you now, not because the contract says I should, but because I haven't been able to stop thinking about it since I saw you in that dress you wore last night, and now I can't help it anymore. You look more irresistible." That's not exactly what I was. I tried to explain my way out or maybe protest. But he kissed me before I could finish the sentence, and dear friend, I will tell you honestly, I have been kissed on camera by men paid to make it look convincing. I have never, not once, been kissed like that man kissed me on this terrace, like he was trying to memorize the feel of my lips in his brain, like the kiss itself was a promise and a question all at once. When he pulled back, both of us were breathing like we'd run somewhere. "That," I managed, "was not in the contract." "No," he agreed, his thumb slowly brushing my jaw. "That was free." "I don't do free." "Then let's call it an advance," he murmured against my temple, "on everything I intend to give you." 10 days. That's what we agreed to. Neither of us had any idea how fast 10 days was about to stop feeling like enough. I learned the rest of Aiden's story in pieces, the way you learn most things about a person you're falling for, not in one tidy confession, but scattered across car rides and quiet mornings, and the particular hour after midnight when people loosen up and stop trying to mask themselves. He was born in Busan, not Seoul, a detail he mentioned almost apologetically, like it was a stain on the polished biography his PR team had built for him. His father had inherited a mid-sized shipping company and turned it, through 2 decades of ruthless expansion, into the sprawling conglomerate that now bore the family name on buildings across 3 continents. Aiden had been groomed for the role of heir apparent since before he could properly hold chopsticks. Private tutors in 6 languages, boarding school in Switzerland at 11, an MBA from Wharton he'd finished a year early because, as he put it, there is no version of falling behind that my father considers acceptable, including falling behind a schedule he invented himself. "When did you last do something just because you wanted to?" I asked him one morning when I spent the night, curled against his chest in the enormous bed, sunlight cutting gold stripes across the sheets. "Before you met me, I mean." He was quiet long enough that I thought he might not answer. "I bought a motorcycle when I was 23, he said finally. Against every piece of advice from every person paid to advise me. Rode it exactly once, down the coast road outside Busan, at 2 a.m, alone, with no security detail, no phone, nothing. My father found out within 6 hours. Someone recognized me at a gas station, and had it sold to the press by the next morning without asking me." He paused, and I was totally mesmerized with the way his Adam apple bobbed up and down. Then he continued. "I didn't fight him on it. I told myself it wasn't worth the argument. It took me another 8 years to admit that wasn't the reason. I just didn't believe, yet, that I was allowed to want things that weren't already part of the plan." "And now?" I asked slowly, curious to hear what he had to say. He looked down at me, something unguarded moving across his face. "Now I picked up a beautiful woman on an impulse who was standing on the side of a hill in an ungodly hour. And I haven't thought about anything else since then. I must admit, it felt exhilarating. I wasn't planning to get stranded on purpose by that hour." "No need for your explanation. You know what I mean," he replied, holding eye contact with me in an intense way that made me feel like he could read my mind. I didn't bother to reply, because somehow I understood his words, and exactly what he meant, in a way I hadn't expected to. Because somewhere underneath billions of dollars, a perfect body and a handsome face, Aiden Minjun was a boy who'd spent his entire life being told exactly who he was allowed to become. But somehow, on a random night, he had decided a stranded actress with a bag of cold chips was worth breaking the pattern for. "For what it's worth," I told him, tracing a lazy finger down his chest, "I think the motorcycle sounds hot. We should get you another one." "Absolutely not. My security team will resign as a group." "Coward," I teased him. "I'm more of a strategist," he corrected, flipping me onto my back with a suddenness that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with the fact that neither of us had anywhere to be for another 3 hours. "There's a difference." We both collapsed on top of each other, laughing so much harder than we've done in a long time. The Hanmin Foundation Gala was held in a hotel ballroom downtown that had been transformed into something out of a dream. Chandeliers the size of small cars, orchids flown in from 3 continents, a string quartet playing something that sounded like old money and older secrets. I wore black, not because black was safe. Truth be told, there is nothing safe about the dress Saline, Aiden's stylist, had sent over that afternoon. It was cut low in the back, fitted through the waist, and it made every curve I owned look like it had been sculpted for exactly this moment. My hair, natural and curling in loose spirals down my back, was left mostly alone, because Aiden had specifically told the stylist, and I quote, "No need touching her hair, those strands are already magnificent." When I walked into the living room where he was waiting, he set down his phone without looking at it again for the rest of the night. "You're gawking," I said, echoing his words on our first night. "I'm allowed to gawk at my date." "Am I your date or your employee?" "Tonight," he said, offering his arm, "you're going to be the reason every man in that ballroom is going to hate me." Well, he wasn't wrong. We walked into a wave of heads turning, the particular hum of a room realigning itself around a new center of gravity. Richard Calloway, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, found us within the first 10 minutes, sizing me up with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd spent a career reading people. "Aiden," he said, extending a hand, eyes flicking to me with open curiosity. "And who is this?" "Athena," Aiden said, and something about the way he said my real name, my actual name, in front of a room full of strangers, made my chest go tight. "Athena Tucker." "Tucker," Calloway repeated. "Any relation to the Tuckers in finance?" "No," I said, smiling sweetly. "Any relation to the Calloways who nearly tanked their own media company in 2019 chasing a bad streaming deal." Aiden made a sound next to me that was suspiciously close to a laugh disguised as a cough. Calloway's eyebrows shot up. Then, slowly, he smiled, the first genuine one I'd see from him all night. "I like her," he said to Aiden. "She's sharp. You don't usually go for sharp." "I've apparently been doing it wrong, until I met her," Aiden said, and the look he gave me could have set the whole ballroom on fire. For the next 2 hours, I did what I do best. I performed. I laughed at the right moments, asked Calloway's wife thoughtful questions about her charity work, let Aiden's hand rest warm and possessive at the small of my back through 3 separate conversations, and somewhere around the second glass of champagne, I stopped performing entirely and just enjoyed it. Enjoyed being with him. The way his thumb traced absent circles against my spine when he thought no one was watching. The way he'd lean down to murmur translations or gossip in my ear. His breath warm against my neck, making it very difficult to focus on anything Mrs. Calloway was saying about her foundation's new wing. Then the orchestra shifted into something slower, and he pulled me onto the dance floor without asking. "I don't know this dance," I whispered. "Neither do I. Follow me anyway." "That's a terrible strategy." "It's worked for me so far." We swayed badly, both of us laughing under our breath at how neither of us actually knew what we were doing, and somewhere in the middle of that laughter, he stopped moving entirely and just looked at me. "What?" I asked. "Nothing," he said. "I just keep forgetting every few minutes that I'm paying you to be here." "Is that a problem?" "It's a very expensive problem," he murmured, "because I think I'd have paid double to have this exact night with you, and I never would have told you that if you hadn't already signed the contract." "Careful," I said, sliding my arms around his neck. "That's a dangerous idea you're giving me. Might as well start reconsidering our contract." "I'm a dangerous man, and you signed the papers, remember." "You're a marshmallow in a very expensive suit," I teased him, leaning more into his strength as we swayed. He laughed, really laughed, with his head tipping back, and half the ballroom turned to look at the sound of it, because apparently Aiden Minjun had never laughed like that in public, ever, and I had somehow become the reason he did. We left before midnight, his hand laced through mine the entire ride down in the elevator, the tension between us so thick I could have cut it with the diamond earrings he'd delivered that morning. A gift, he'd said, not a requirement from the contract, and I hadn't argued because, dear friend, I told you already. I am not the kind of heroine who refuses diamonds and luxury items. I wore them, and I loved them. I planned to be buried in something equally excessive. In the car, he didn't say anything. He just watched me across the back seat, the city lights sliding gold across his face, and I watched him back, and the air between us charged with so much electricity in a magnetic way that had nothing to do with champagne. Aiden, I called his name slowly. Athena, if you don't kiss me in the next 10 seconds, I'm going to combust. He didn't wait for 10 seconds. He crossed the seat in one motion, and his mouth was on mine before I finished the sentence, one hand fisting gently in my curls, the other sliding along my bare thigh where the slit of my dress had fallen open. I moaned against his mouth, and he groaned low in response, pulling me half into his lap without breaking the kiss. We're not doing this in the back of a car like teenagers, he muttered against my throat, though his hands did not seem to have gotten the memo, because they were currently mapping every inch of skin the dress left bare. Where are we doing it then? My house, my bed. We will be there in 10 minutes. His teeth grazed my earlobe, and I felt it everywhere and down in my groin all at once. And Athena, when we get there, I am not going to be gentle about how badly I've wanted you since that night that I picked you up. Good, I breathed. I was starting to think you'd never ask. He said 10 minutes. It felt like the longest 10 minutes of my entire life. The house was dark and silent when we arrived, the staff long since gone for the night, and the only light came from the pool below, throwing soft blue ripples across the ceiling of his bedroom as he backed me against the door and kissed me like he was trying to make up for every hour of the night we hadn't been alone. I'm not going to give you every detail, dear friend, because some experience like this one is mine to keep. But I will tell you this. Aiden Minjun did not do anything by half measures. Not in business, not in gift-giving, and certainly not in the way he peeled that black dress off my shoulders like he'd been waiting his whole life for the privilege, or the way he said my real name, over and over, like it was the only word he had left against my skin. I will tell you it was slow, and then it wasn't. I will tell you he asked more than once in the middle of everything if this was still what I wanted, and single time, I answered yes, louder than the last time. Somewhere around 2 a.m, tangled in luxury silky sheets, he pulled me against his chest and pressed a kiss into my curls and said quietly, like it cost him a lot to admit it, I don't want this to end in 10 days. Aiden, I asked, my eyes slowly fluttering open as I was still basking in the feel of our lovemaking. I know what the contract says. His arms tightened around me. I don't care anymore. Let's extend it. A month, a year. I'll pay whatever you want. I lifted my head to look at him, moonlight catching the sharp line of his jaw, the softness in his eyes that hadn't been there on that hillside a night and a lifetime ago. You can't just buy me to make me stay, Aiden. A strange emotion flickered across his face. Old fear, maybe, or old habit, the reflex of a man who'd learned that everything, eventually, has a price. Then what would it take? I traced a finger along his jaw, feeling braver than I had any right to feel at 2 a.m, naked in a billionaire's bed. 6 days into a contract I'd already stopped thinking about as a contract. Just ask me, I said softly. Not as a business proposal, just ask. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he tucked a curl behind my ear, and his voice, when it came, was rougher than I'd ever heard it. Please stay with me, Athena. Not for the money, not for the contract, because I think I've been half in love with you since the night I met you. That's the least romantic sentence I've ever heard, I said, laughing even as my eyes stung. I'm working on my delivery. Please say yes anyway. Yes, I whispered. Obviously, yes. He kissed me again, slower this time, like we had all the time in the world instead of 4 days left on paper. Somewhere between the hillside and the penthouse, our fake relationship had quietly stopped being true. I had never flown private before. I want to be honest with you about that, because I think a lot of stories like to pretend the heroine is unmoved by luxury, too dignified to gasp at a jet with her name embroidered on the pillows. I gasped. I gasped audibly, and Aiden looked entirely too pleased with himself about it. It's just a plane, he said, watching me run my hand over the leather seats like I was petting a very expensive cat. It's not just a plane, Aiden. There's a bedroom on this plane. There's a shower, too. I'm aware, I already have plans for that shower. His eyebrows shot up, and the 14-hour flight to Seoul suddenly felt like it wasn't nearly long enough. We landed to a black car waiting on the tarmac, and within an hour I was standing in a penthouse on the 61st floor of a building with the Hanmin name etched into the lobby in gold, looking out over a city that glittered like something out of a dream I hadn't known I was allowed to have. "Tomorrow," Aiden said, coming up behind me, arms circling my waist, chin resting against my curls, "you meet my grandmother." Should I be scared? "Terrified," he said, and I felt him smile against my hair. "She once made a Samsung executive cry over dumplings." "Fantastic. I love dumplings and crying." Halmoni Han was 83 years old, barely 5 feet tall, and had the kind of gaze that made me understand, instantly, exactly where Aiden got his ability to stare a person down without saying a word. She looked me over for a long, silent moment across a table of more banchan than I could name, then asked, in careful but precise English, "You are American?" "Yes, ma'am." "An actress?" I glanced at Aiden, who had very clearly briefed his grandmother before we walked in, which meant this whole conversation was a test, not a discovery. "Yes, ma'am. I go by Angel professionally, but my name is Athena." "Athena," she turned the name over slowly. The way Aiden had that first night. "Goddess of wisdom, good, this family has enough men who think with other parts of themselves." Her eyes flicked, pointed and merciless, toward her grandson. "Perhaps he needs a wise woman beside him." Aiden choked on his tea. I bit back a laugh so hard my ribs hurt. "Tell me," Halmoni continued, unbothered, "do you love him, or do you love what he can afford to give you, like the plane?" The bluntness of it stole my breath for a second, but I'd learned, over the last week, that this family did not respect softened answers. "Both, if I'm honest," I said. "I loved the plane immediately. I'm still figuring out how fast I fell for him, faster than I meant to." An emotion shifted in the old woman's face. It looked like a smile, but she wasn't smiling. "Good," she said, and reached over to pat my hand with fingers that were surprisingly gentle for a woman who had, according to Aiden, once made a Samsung executive weep. "Honest women last longer in this family than pretty ones. You are, fortunately, both." "Okay, before we continue, can I ask you something real quick? I'm trying to figure out where people who love good stories are watching from. These days, are you team phone in bed, team laptop at work, or team living room TV? Drop a comment and let me know what team you are and where in the world you're watching this story from. I will personally reply to every single comment in the first hour. Hit that like and subscribe button. Now, let's proceed." Not everyone in Seoul was as easy to win over as Halmoni. 2 days into the trip, Aiden had a board meeting at the Hanmin Tower and asked me to sit in on the reception, more optics, more proof for Callaway's people, who had flown in for the final signature on the acquisition. I stood near the window in a designer silk dress, sipping something sparkling, half listening to a conversation between 2 board members who clearly didn't realize I understood enough Korean, thanks to 2 years of language classes for a role I'd never even booked, to catch every word. "Paying her, obviously," one man was saying low to another. "You've seen the girls he's brought before. This one's just prettier, more expensive probably." "She's American," the other replied, like that explained everything. "It won't last past the signature. He needs a wife who understands the business, not an actress." I kept my face perfectly still, the way you learn to on set when a scene calls for devastation you can't let show yet. But something inside my chest cracked, quiet and sharp, like a hairline fracture in glass. Aiden found me 20 minutes later, on the balcony, alone, the city spread out cold and glittering below. "You've gone quiet," he said, sliding an arm around me. I understood what they were saying about me in there. His whole body went still. "Athena. Just paid company, right? Prettier than the last one. Won't last past the signature." I turned to face him, and I hated that my eyes were stinging, hated that I let it show. "Is that all this is to your board, Aiden? To your world, a very well-dressed transaction?" "It's not what it is to me. But it's what everyone else sees when they look at us. I don't control what small men whisper at a reception." His hands framed my face, urgent, and there was something raw in his eyes I hadn't seen since that first night on the terrace. I control what I do about it. Watch. He walked back inside, pulling me with him, straight toward the two men who'd been talking, straight through the middle of the crowded reception, and did not lower his voice at all when he said, in clear, deliberate English so every single person in that room understood him perfectly. I'd like to introduce all of you properly to Athena Tucker, not my date for the signature. She's my partner, the woman I intend to marry whenever she'll have me, and it has nothing to do with whether or not this deal closes tomorrow. His eyes never left mine. Anyone who has a problem with my personal life is welcome to take it up with me directly. My grandmother, however, will be far less polite about it than I will. The room went very, very quiet. I stared at him, my heart was hammering somewhere up in my throat. Aiden, don't, I tried to whisper, but he wasn't done. I meant it, he said, quieter now, just for me, his thumb brushing my cheekbone. Every word. I should have said it before some idiot in a bad suit made you doubt it. He just said Mary in front of his entire board. I hadn't even had time to process it before the room started applauding, and somewhere behind us, someone was already on the phone, and not to congratulate him. The acquisition closed the next morning. Calloway signed with a grin, shook Aiden's hand, and told me privately that I was wasting my talent, sharp as you are. You should be running a studio, not starring in one. I decided to take that as the compliment it was clearly meant to be. Aiden, in what I would learn was a very on-brand move, celebrated the biggest deal of his career by closing his phone, handing it to Hyun-woo, and telling him not to open it again for 5 days. Where are we going? I asked, as the jet climbed out over the Han River. Greece, he said, like it was the most obvious answer in the world. I have a house there. Of course you do. The house? I mean his villa, honestly, because calling it a house felt like calling the Sistine Chapel a nice ceiling. Sat carved into the cliffs of Oya, white stone and blue-shuttered windows, a private infinity pool that seemed to spill straight into the Aegean itself. We arrived at golden hour, the whole sky bruised pink and orange, and I stood on the terrace in a white cover-up over my bikini, watching the sun drop into the water, and felt my chest feel full. In case you were wondering, Aiden said, coming up behind me, arms wrapping around my waist, chin resting on my shoulder. I meant what I said in the boardroom, but I intend to do the proposal part properly. Good, I said, leaning back into him. Because if you propose to me in front of your entire board again, I'm going to need at least a ring before I answer. I teased him with one of my wicked smiles. Duly noted, he murmured over my hair. We spent 5 days doing absolutely nothing productive. We ate too much fresh fish and drank too much wine that tasted like sunlight, and I painted, badly, for the first time in years, just for the joy of it, while he read on the terrace beside me, occasionally glancing up like he still couldn't quite believe I was real. On the 4th night, he took me down a narrow cliffside path to a private cove. No staff, no cameras, just the two of us and a blanket and a bottle of wine he'd carried down himself, which felt like the single most romantic thing a man worth $11 billion had ever done for me. It wasn't even the villa, not the jet, not the diamonds either. A handsome man carrying his own wine down a cliff because he wanted to be alone with me. Can I tell you something crazy? He said, as the stars came out over the water. Always, I replied. I've had more money than I could spend since I was 26 years old. I've had women, dinners, houses on every continent that mattered. I have never, not once, wanted to carry my own wine anywhere for anyone. He turned to face me, moonlight radiating on his face. You make me want to do the small, stupid, unglamorous things. Carry the wine. Learn to make your coffee the way you like it instead of having someone else learn it for me. I don't know what that is exactly, but I know I don't want it to stop. That, I whispered, might be the most romantic thing anyone has ever said to me, and I have been kissed by 3 separate Marvel actors on camera. He laughed, and then he kissed me, slow and unhurried under a sky full of stars, on a beach that belonged, technically, to him, but felt in that moment like it belonged entirely to us. What happened after on that blanket, I will leave mostly to your imagination, except to say that the Aegean Sea has never seen 2 people more thoroughly forget the concept of time, and that somewhere around midnight, tangled together under the stars, skin still warm from his hands. I understood with total, terrifying clarity that my heart was not going to survive the healing process if I let this man go. Good thing, then, that neither of us had any plans to let go. We landed back from Santorini sundrunk and tangled up in each other, and walked straight into a scandal neither of us had seen coming. Priya called before we'd even cleared customs, her voice pitched at a register I'd only ever heard once before, the week a co-star's DUI had threatened to take an entire production down with him. "There are photos," she said without preamble. "You and Aiden, the cove in Santorini, long lens from a boat probably. TMZ has them. So does the Daily Mail. And Athena." She took a breath I could hear crackle through the phone. "They're not exactly subtle photos." My stomach dropped somewhere around my knees. How not subtle? Not naked, but close enough that the headline is "Angel's Secret Billionaire Getaway. Who is Aiden Minjun and is this real?" They're speculating you're a paid escort. There's a quote from an unnamed source close to the family, saying the Han family is, quote, "deeply concerned about the optics." I looked over at Aiden, who had gone very still beside me in the back of the car, jaw tight, already scrolling through something on his own phone with a cold expression I hadn't seen on him before. "They use the word escort," I said quietly. "I saw it." His voice was tight. "I'm handling it." "How exactly do you handle a headline that's already live in 40 countries, Aiden?" "I own a media conglomerate as of 11 days ago," he said, and there was something almost savage in the way he said it, like he'd been waiting his whole life for a reason that actually mattered to use the kind of power he'd otherwise never wanted. "Watch me." By the time we reached the house, his legal team was already on a call. His head of communications had already drafted 3 versions of a statement, and I sat on the edge of the couch, still in yesterday's sundress, watching the machinery of a billion-dollar company spin into motion around the two of us, and felt, for the first time since that hillside, genuinely small. "I don't want a statement that protects your reputation and throws mine under the bus," I said, once the calls had ended, and it was just the two of us in the too quiet living room. "I've seen how this works. I've watched it happen to other women. The man stays linked to, the woman becomes controversial. I won't be your controversial footnote, Aiden." He crossed the room and knelt in front of where I sat, taking both of my hands in his, and there was no pretense in his face at all. Just a man, although scared, trying to fix something that mattered more to him than anything a spreadsheet had ever taught him to value. "There is no statement going out that does not name you as my partner," he said, low and fierce. "You're not my companion or just a friend. Athena, you are partner in every sense of the word, with my name behind it and my lawyers ready to bury anyone who says otherwise. I have spent my whole life protecting a company's reputation. I am telling you, right now, that yours matters more to me than every asset I own combined." "That's a nice speech." "It's not a speech. Read the draft." He held out his phone, and there, in stark black text on his company's official letterhead, was a statement that named me, Athena Tucker, not Angel, not a source, not a rumor, as the woman he loved, the woman he intended to build a life with, and closed with a line that made my throat go tight. "Any outlet that continues to use degrading language about Ms. Tucker will be pursued for defamation to the full extent the law allows. She has earned every part of her career and every part of my heart, and I will not stand by while either is diminished." "You wrote this?" "Every word." I looked up at him, this sweet man who owned buildings on 3 continents and had just used every ounce of that power in defense of a woman he'd met on a hillside less than 3 weeks ago, and felt inside my chest crack open for him, in ways I could barely express with words. "Okay, send it. Let's see what would be the reaction of the press," I said quietly. He sent it. By morning, the narrative had flipped entirely. I was no more mystery billionaire escort. Rather, it was billionaire fiercely defends actress girlfriend. And Priya called again, this time laughing, to tell me that 3 separate magazines wanted exclusive interviews, and my Instagram had gained over 400,000 new followers overnight. "Silver linings," Aiden murmured against my hair that night, both of us finally horizontal after the longest 24 hours of the whole arrangement. "Though I'd have preferred you get famous for something other than my legal team's fury." "I'm an actress, Aiden. I'll take publicity however it arrives. I tucked myself closer against his chest, though I could have hated the publicity if it came with the word escort trending on 2 continents. Never again, he said, and the low, dangerous promise in his voice told me he meant it in a way that went far beyond one bad headline. The tabloids were handled. His father, unfortunately, was not, and Chairman Han had just landed back in Seoul with a very different kind of headline sitting on his desk. We flew back to Seoul 2 days later, not the romantic return trip I'd imagined, but it was more of a strategic one. Aiden insisted to get ahead of the narrative before my father does it for us. Which was how I found myself, less than 48 hours after being called an escort by half the English-speaking internet, standing in the middle of Gwangjang Market at 7 in the morning in a baseball cap and sunglasses, watching the most powerful bachelor in Asia attempt, and fail spectacularly, to go unrecognized among a crowd of street food vendors. This is a terrible disguise, I told him, watching an elderly woman selling bindidiak do a full double take, drop her spatula, and start whispering urgently to the vendor beside her. It's worked before. It has never worked. You walk like a man who's never once had to wait in line for anything in his life. That's because I haven't. That's exactly the problem, Aiden. He laughed, tugging his cap lower, and pulled me toward a stall selling something that smelled like heaven and looked like a small, glorious delicacy. There was mung bean pancakes sizzling on a massive flat top, oil popping, and Ajima working 3 pans at once with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had clearly seen empires rise and fall and remained entirely unimpressed by any of it. You need to eat real food, he said, not the 7-course nonsense my father's chef makes. This is what I actually grew up eating, when my grandmother could sneak me out without my father finding out. The Ajima took one look at Aiden's face, squinted, gasped audibly, and then, entirely undeterred by his billions, smacked him on the arm with her spatula and said something rapid in Korean that made him laugh so hard he had to lean against the stall to stay upright. What did she say? She said I've gotten too skinny since the last time she saw me on television, and that whatever woman is starving me needs to be sent home immediately. He grinned, wiping his eyes. I told her you're the opposite problem. You feed me constantly, and I've never been happier about it. The Ajima looked me over, nodded approvingly, and loaded 3 extra pancakes onto our plate without being asked, refusing payment with the kind of firmness that apparently transcended language entirely. We ate standing at the stall, oil-stained and grinning, tucked into a corner of a market that had never once cared about billion-dollar acquisitions or tabloid headlines. And I understood, watching Aiden lick sauce off his thumb like the happiest, most ordinary man alive, exactly why he'd risked getting recognized to bring me here. This is my favorite version of you, I told him. The disguised one. The one who isn't performing for anyone. Not for the board members, your father, or even the cameras. Just you, eating pancakes badly, getting hit with a spatula by a woman who's known you since you were small enough to sneak out with your grandmother. He went quiet for a moment, watching me with an expression I was starting to recognize. The one that meant he was filing something away, deciding it mattered more than he wanted to admit out loud. I want you to have this version of me forever, he said finally. Not just the terms we agreed on the contract. Thank goodness, the contract doesn't stand anymore. A warm smile tugged at the corner of his lips. I want this with you, Athena, the sneaking around in the market with bad disguises, all of it. You already hinted that you wanted forever in the boardroom, remember, in front of your entire board. I know, I'm saying it again, quieter, somewhere that isn't for anyone else's benefit. He reached out and slowly tucked a curl behind my ear, his oil-stained thumb warm against my cheek. Just so you know, I meant it just as much without an audience. Of course, no fairy tale gets to stay uncomplicated for long. Ours certainly didn't. We went back to his family estate in Seoul to a message waiting on Aiden's phone from his father. Not grandmother Halmoni, who had already claimed me as her own, but Chairman Han himself, who had apparently returned early from a business trip in Singapore specifically to have what he called, ominously, a conversation about the future of this family. The conversation happened in his study. All dark wood and cold formality, and I was not invited, which told me everything I needed to know before Aiden even walked back out an hour later, jaw tight, a muscle ticking that I'd never seen tick before. What happened? My father has spent 11 years quietly arranging a marriage between myself and Seoyeon Park, daughter of the Park chemical family. Merging the companies has been his plan since I was in university. He said it flatly, like reciting a business memo, but his hands were clenched at his sides. He is under the impression that whatever this is between us, he gestured towards me, is a phase, an American distraction before I come to my senses. And Seoyeon, does she know about this plan? She's known since she was 19. She's not exactly thrilled about it either, from what I understand, but that's never mattered to my father. I felt the old, familiar cold creeping up my spine, the whisper from the reception, wearing a bigger, colder coat this time. Not just paid company. Not even good enough to be the real thing, apparently, once real money and real bloodlines got involved. Aiden, maybe he's right. Maybe I don't belong in this world, and this was always going to end at the border of it. Don't. His voice cracked on the single word, sharper than I'd ever heard it. Don't you dare hand him a win he hasn't earned. I have spent my entire life being told who I am allowed to become. I am not doing it again. This is not about you. Aiden. I need you to trust me, he said, pulling me close, forehead resting against mine. Give me 48 hours. I have an idea, and it involves a very public dinner, my father, Seoyeon, and a decision he is not going to enjoy watching me make in front of every person whose opinion he actually cares about. That sounds like a terrible idea. It's an excellent idea, he said, and kissed my forehead. I learn negotiation from the best. Watch me. 48 hours, one dinner. A father who'd spent 11 years planning a wedding I wasn't part of. I should have been terrified. Instead, I found myself oddly, dangerously excited to watch Aiden Minjun go to war for me. Before we went to face Chairman Han and whatever war Aiden had planned, he insisted on one detour. My world, for once, instead of his. You've been with me at galas, boardrooms, and a market where a woman hit me with a spatula, he said, adjusting his cufflinks in the mirror while I zipped myself into a dress the color of warm honey that Saline had specifically picked for me. I would like to see the world you actually live in, the kind of friends you have, and your life before all this drama. That world involves a wrap party in a converted warehouse in Silver Lake with warm beer, and a DJ who only plays songs from 2013. Perfect, he said, entirely serious. I've never had warm beer in my life. I intend to correct that tonight. He was, predictably, both completely out of place and utterly delighted by it. He stood in a corner of the warehouse, in a suit that cost more than the building's last 3 renovations combined, holding a plastic cup of lukewarm domestic beer like it was a rare vintage, while my co-star Desiree circled him twice, looked him up and down with a frank appraisal of a woman who had absolutely nothing to lose, and announced to the entire room, Angel, baby, if you don't marry this man, I will personally stage a war. We're working on it, I told her, and Aiden nearly choked on his beer. He met my director, who spent 20 minutes interrogating him about supply chain logistics for absolutely no reason other than curiosity, and my stunt coordinator, who challenged him, apropos of nothing, to an arm wrestling match that Aiden, shockingly, gleefully, won to the roaring approval of half the crew. He danced badly to a song from 2013 with an enthusiasm that made up for every ounce of missing rhythm, spun me under his arm twice, nearly took out a lighting rig on the 3rd attempt, and laughed so hard apologizing for the grip he'd used to almost injure his opponent, that the poor man ended up laughing too, utterly disarmed. This is not what I expected billionaire behavior to look like, I told him later, both of us leaning against a cool brick wall outside, the party's noise muffled behind us, the LA night warm and close. What did you expect? Standing in a corner looking superior, complaining about the beer, leaving early to take a call. I did think about the beer, briefly, around 4 minutes, he admitted, tugging me closer by the waist. But then your stunt coordinator challenged me to arm wrestling, and I discovered I would rather lose gracefully to your friends than win at anything happening back at the office tonight. You didn't lose, you won. I know, It was a very satisfying evening on every front. He tucked a curl behind my ear, thumb lingering against my cheekbone. Thank you for this, for letting me see the parts of your life that have nothing to do with contracts or headlines. I think I needed reminding that you had an entire world before I stumbled into it. I had an entire world, I agreed, tipping my face up toward him. It's just gotten considerably better since you did. He kissed me slow against that brick wall, warm beer and 2013 pop music, and the particular unglamorous joy of a rap party humming behind us. And I thought, not for the first time, that I had never once expected the most romantic moments of this entire fairy tale to happen in the plainest possible places. A hillside, a market stall, a warehouse with a broken sound system, instead of the expensive private jet's trips and the luxury jewels. The jets and the jewels were wonderful. I will never pretend otherwise, but it was always the ordinary moments like this that I fell the hardest. 2 days before the dinner Aiden had promised would end in war, we ran into someone I hadn't planned for. The first woman his father had actually wanted him to marry, before Seo-yeon was ever in the picture. She was Yoona Bae, a K-drama star so polished she looked lit for camera in ordinary restaurant lighting, and as it turned out, Aiden's ex-fiancé of 4 years past. She found us at a cousin's dinner overlooking the Han River, kissing both of Aiden's cheeks with a familiarity that made something tight and low in my stomach before she'd even said a word to me. Min-jun, her eyes slid to me, harshly assessing me in an unhurried way. I heard the rumors. I had to see for myself. Yoona, this is Athena. Angel, she corrected smoothly. I know exactly who you are. I watched Palisades 3 times. You cried very convincingly in the rain scene. She paused, still assessing me. Is that what this is too? A very convincing performance. Yoona, Aiden said, warning creeping into his voice. I'm only asking what everyone at this table is wondering, darling. She turned fully to me now, her wicked smile never wavering. We were engaged for 2 years. I know exactly how good Min-jun is at making a woman feel like the only one in the room. I also know exactly how it ends, poorly, publicly, with his father's approval withdrawn at the worst possible moment. The table had gone quiet, several cousins suddenly fascinated by their wine glasses. I felt the old, familiar anxiety of 100 auditions rise up in my chest. Then I had to cover it with the practiced calm I'd perfected over these years like a woman who'd learned exactly how to hold a room without flinching. That's a generous amount of information to volunteer to a stranger, I said, keeping my voice light, almost sweet. Should I be taking notes, or is this more of a cautionary campfire story you tell every time he brings someone new to dinner? A few cousins laughed, badly disguised as coughs. Yoona's smile tightened by exactly 1 degree. I'm simply protecting a man I still care about. That's sweet, I said, but I've read the contract, the prenup, and every legal document his team has generated in the last 3 weeks. I don't need protection from anything you're worried about, least of all an ex who refuses to move on and apparently still keeps a very close eye on his dinner reservations. Aiden made a sound beside me suspiciously close to a laugh, disguised as a cough of his own. Then he found my hand under the table, lacing our fingers together in a warm gesture that gave me the support I needed. Yoona held my gaze for a long moment, then a strange expression shifted behind her eyes. I wouldn't call it respect yet, but it was close. Interesting, she said finally. He usually goes for women who let him win the argument. I don't let anyone win arguments. I lose them fair and square when they've earned it. So far, tonight, you haven't. I fired back at her. She laughed softly and raised her glass towards me in something like a toast. Fine, I concede this round. Her eyes flicked to Aiden, softer now. Something wistful passing between them that clearly had nothing to do with me anymore. Take care of her, Min-jun. Actually take care of her. Not the way you almost took care of me. She left before dessert. What did she mean by that? I asked once we were alone in the car. He was quiet, watching the city slide past the window. I proposed to Yoona 4 years ago. My father engineered it, another merger disguised as a marriage, though I didn't fully understand that at the time. I asked because it was expected, and she said yes for exactly the same reason. Neither of us had chosen the role we were performing. His jaw tightened. She called it off 3 weeks before the wedding. told me, very honestly, that she deserved a marriage where someone actually fought for her, not one where her father simply approved the paperwork. I was furious then. It took me 2 years to understand she'd been right all along. And now, he said, turning to look at me, all the warmth I loved rushing back into his face. I understand exactly what fighting for someone actually looks like. I intend to do it tomorrow night, in front of my father, and every night after that for the rest of my life. That was a perfect answer, I said, and kissed him slowly and thoroughly in the back of a car gliding through Seoul, entirely unbothered by the ghost of an old engagement that had, in the end, only cleared the road for me. Dinner was held at the Han family's private dining room at the top of the tower, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking all of Gangnam glittering below. Chairman Han sat at the head of the table, silver-haired and immaculate, flanked by a visibly uncomfortable Seoyeon Park, who I liked almost immediately, mostly because the second I sat down, she leaned over and whispered in flawless English, "I've never been happier to see another woman at this table. Please, for the love of God, take this off my hands." I decided, right then, that Seoyeon and I were going to be friends for a very long time. Dinner was tense and formal. It was 7 courses of exquisite food I could barely taste over the anxiety in the room. Chairman Han asked me pointed questions about my finances, my long-term plans, my understanding of what it meant to marry into a family like his, questions clearly designed to make me either cry or crack. I did neither. I answered every single one with the same steady calm I'd learned reading for roles far scarier than this dinner. Finally, over dessert, Chairman Han set down his spoon and addressed his son directly, in clipped, formal Korean. I didn't really understand every word, but I was able to pick up the message. "You've had your fun, Minjun. It's time to be serious. The park merger is worth $4 billion in synergies. What is she worth?" The entire table went silent. Aiden set down his own glass, slow and deliberate, and I watched years of careful compliance finally, completely, burn to the ground behind his eyes. "You want to know her worth, father?" He stood, and every person at that table straightened with him, drawn upward by the sheer gravity of him. "She negotiated her own contract with me the first night we met, and won. She learned enough Korean in 2 years, on the off chance a role required it, that she caught your board members insulting her at a reception and didn't flinch. My grandmother, your own mother, told me 2 days ago that Athena is the first woman I've brought home who she'd trust to run this company better than either of us, if she ever wanted to. She is worth considerably more than $4 billion in synergies, and unlike the park merger, I don't need a spreadsheet to prove it." He turned to Seoyeon, who was watching the whole scene with barely restrained delight. "Seoyeon, I mean this with the deepest respect. You deserve a marriage you actually chose. I hope, whatever happens tonight, you get exactly that." "Please," she said, raising her wine glass, "somebody get a camera. This is the best dinner I've had at this table in a decade." Chairman Han's face had gone a shade of red I genuinely worried might be medically significant. "Minjun, sit down. We are not finished." "I am." Aiden turned to me, and every ounce of hardness in his face melted into warmth the moment his eyes locked into mine. "Athena, stand up." "Aiden, what are you doing?" I tried to protest. "Please stand up," he said again, softer now, and then slowly reached into his jacket pocket. In that instant, I understood, with a jolt that stole every ounce of air from my lungs, exactly what was happening. Before I could blink, Aiden dropped to one knee in front of Seoyeon, in front of the Chairman Han himself, his own father, and opened a small black box containing a huge sapphire ring that made my eyes pop, or should I say it almost blinded me because of its radiance. "I told a boardroom full of strangers I intended to marry you before I'd even said it to you properly," he said, his voice rough, eyes bright. "So let me do it properly, right now, in front of the one person in this world I most need to hear it. Athena Tucker, please marry me. Because I have never in my life wanted anything the way I want a lifetime with you, carrying your wine down cliffs, or losing arguments to you at family dinners, and coming home to you every single night for the rest of my life." The whole room was silent. Chairman Han looked like he'd swallowed a live wire. Seoyeon looked like she was about to cry actual, delighted tears. And me. I looked down at the most beautiful man I had ever met, kneeling on marble floors in a room full of people who had spent the last hour trying to decide if I was worthy of him. And I understood with total clarity that I had never once needed their permission. "Yes," I said, and my voice broke on the word and I didn't care. "Yes, obviously yes, you absolute handsome marshmallow." He laughed, that rare, full laugh I'd fallen for on a hillside a lifetime ago, and slid the ring onto my finger. Then he kissed me right there in front of his stunned father, and somewhere behind us, Sioyon actually started clapping, alone, gleefully, the only person in that room fully on our side from the very beginning. Halmoni Han's threat to disinherit her own son if he continued to be difficult, apparently, worked wonders, because 2 weeks after the dinner that ended with Chairman Han nearly choking on his own outrage, he did something none of us expected. He invited my mother to Seoul. My mother, who had never once left the United States in 51 years of life, boarded a first-class flight Aiden arranged without so much as a blink, texted me the entire 14 hours with a level of enthusiasm I hadn't seen from her since I booked my first speaking role, and arrived at Incheon wearing a hat so large it required its own overhead bin space. "Baby," she said, the second she saw Aiden waiting at arrivals, "you didn't tell me he looked like that in person. Pictures do not do this man justice." "Mama," I said, hugging her, "I'm just saying what everybody's thinking." She murmured against me as she squeezed me in her warm embrace. When we were done hugging, she turned to Aiden, extended a hand adorned with the same acrylics she'd been doing on other women's nails for 2 decades, and said, with total, unbothered confidence, "You hurt my daughter, I will fly back to this country and hurt you. Understood." Aiden, to his eternal credit, did not so much as blink. He took her hand, kissed the back of it with the same easy grace he used on visiting dignitaries, and said, "Understood, Ms. Tucker. I'd expect nothing less." My mother turned to me, eyes shining. "Oh, I like him already." The dinner that followed should have been a disaster by every rule of etiquette either family operated on. There was my mother, Elijah, who'd flown in a day later once his exam schedule allowed, Halmoni, and awkwardly but genuinely trying, Chairman Han. Truthfully, I had expected a worse scenario. Instead, the dinner became one of the warmest nights of my entire life. My mother taught dear Halmoni how to properly season collard greens, using ingredients smuggled in her suitcase specifically for the purpose, while Halmoni taught my mother the correct way to fold mandu. Both women bent over a kitchen counter, bickering happily in 2 languages neither fully understood, communicating almost entirely through hand gestures and shared, delighted laughter. Elijah, meanwhile, cornered Aiden by the wine cabinet and asked him, with the blunt fearlessness of a 20-year-old nursing student who had clearly been media trained by his older sister, "So if y'all break up, do I still get to keep flying private, or is that a package deal?" "Elijah," I called his name. "What? I'm being practical. You taught me to be practical in all situations, remember?" Aiden laughed so hard he had to set down his glass. "Package deal, indeed," he said finally, wiping his eyes, "though I intend to make sure it's a permanent one." "That was a good answer," Elijah said, nodding with the satisfaction of a man who'd gotten exactly the answer he wanted, and wandered off to go find out if the villa had a home theater, which, of course, it did. Chairman Han watched the whole chaotic scene from the head of the table, my mother's laugh ringing out over Halmoni's, Elijah interrogating his son's future in terms of private jet privileges, his own mother teaching an American hairdresser to fold dumplings like they'd known each other for decades. And I caught him, just once, in a moment he probably thought no one saw, actually smiling. It was a warm, genuine smile, the kind that reached all the way to his eyes. "She's loud, your family," he said to me later, as the evening wound down, his tone carrying none of the coldness from that first, disastrous dinner. "My son has spent his whole life in rooms that are too quiet. Perhaps that's exactly what this family needed." "Is that your version of a compliment, Chairman Han?" "It is the closest I get," he admitted, and for the first time since I'd met him, I saw exactly where Aiden had learned to say the most important things sideways, wrapped in something more careful than the feeling actually was. Chairman Han did not speak to his son for exactly 6 days. On the 7th, Halmonihan, 83 years old, barely 5 feet tall, and apparently entirely done waiting for her son to catch up to reality, walked into his study, shut the door, and according to the housekeeper who reported the whole thing to me with barely concealed glee, informed her son in no uncertain terms that the girl has more spine than you had at 40, and if you drive your only son away from the first woman who's made him laugh since his mother died, I will leave this entire company to see Hoyon out of spite. Chairman Han called Aiden that evening. It was not, I'm told, an apology exactly. Korean fathers of a certain generation, Aiden explained with a wry, exhausted smile, do not really do apologies. But he invited us both to dinner, and this time, he asked me about my last film instead of my finances, and by dessert, he'd asked, stiffly, almost shyly, in a way that made him briefly, look exactly like his son, whether I thought Halmoni's dumpling recipe could survive being taught to someone who burns rice on a regular basis, which I took, correctly, as the closest thing to a blessing the man was capable of giving. We flew back to Los Angeles 2 weeks later, me for table reading on the film I'd nearly missed entirely, Aiden because, as he put it, I don't intend to let you shoot an entire movie on another continent without me within driving distance. My agent nearly fainted when I explained the huge sapphire ring on my finger. My co-stars spent the first week of filming aggressively Googling my fiancé between takes. And on the morning of the film's eventual premiere, 6 months later, the ring still catching every camera flash on the red carpet, Aiden's hand warm and steady at the small of my back exactly like it had been that first night at the gala. A reporter shoved a microphone in my face and asked the question I'd been waiting for since that first night on the hillside. Angel, is it true you met your fiancé because your rideshare broke down? I looked up at Aiden, who was already looking at me, that same wicked, warm smile from the very first night, still sitting exactly where I'd fallen for it. My name is Athena. I looked into the camera and told the world, and everyone who'd ever known me only as a face on a screen. And yes, he rescued me on a hillside with absolutely no idea who I was, and somehow, by day 6, we were madly in love with each other. Best deal I ever closed, Aiden murmured against my temple, loud enough for the microphone to catch every word, and the whole red carpet erupted into laughter and applause. Our engagement going public made international headlines within 6 hours of that interview that we granted in that movie premiere, which meant we spent our morning as an engaged couple fielding calls from 3 continents instead of, as I'd hoped, staying in bed until noon. Hanmin Group heir engaged to Hollywood's Angel, full story inside, read one headline. Who is Athena Tucker, and what does she know that the rest of us don't? Read another, which I found, honestly, both a little insulting and a little fair. Priya called before I'd even had coffee. I have 4 morning shows fighting over exclusive rights to the engagement story, she said, breathless, delighted, the tone of a woman watching her client's career catch fire in the best possible way. Athena, do you understand what's happening? You're not the mystery woman anymore. You're the story. If I remember correctly, I've been the story since a photographer got a long lens in Santorini. That was a scandal. This is a fairy tale. There is a considerable difference in booking fees. We agreed eventually on one interview, a single, carefully chosen sit-down on our terms, with a journalist Aiden's team vetted twice, and I vetted a 3rd time out of sheer habit. 2 days later, cameras set up in the very living room where we've spent so much time, planning our future together. I sat curled against Aiden's side, the ring catching the studio lights every time I moved my hand, and answered every question with the specific, hard-won honesty I'd promised myself I would give this story from the very beginning. Some sources have suggested that your love story began as an arrangement, the journalist said carefully, watching us both for a reaction. A contract, even. Is there any truth to that? Aiden's hand found mine, steady, unhurried. There's complete truth to that, he said, before I could answer, before either of us could soften it into something more palatable. I offered Athena money to attend a series of events with me, to help close a business deal. She negotiated better terms than my own legal team usually manages, which should have been my first warning that I was about to lose every argument I ever had with her for the rest of my life. The journalist blinked, clearly having expected a denial or a redirect, the usual polished deflection people in our position typically gave. And you're comfortable with that story being public. I'm not comfortable pretending it happened any other way, I said. I signed a contract because I wanted to experience life with him, and I am not ashamed of that. I will not sit here and pretend a working actress accepting fair payment for her time is some kind of scandal, when the same arrangement, if I were a man, would just be called a business deal. Something shifted across the journalist's face. It looked like someone realizing the story they'd come to extract wasn't the one they were going to leave with. And somewhere in that arrangement, Aiden added, voice rough with emotion, I fell in love with a woman who was a damsel in distress in the night we met, and then spent the following months teaching me that everything I thought mattered were worth considerably less than one honest conversation with her. I am not ashamed of how we started. I am only sorry it took me 28 days to say the important part out loud. By the time the interview aired, the tabloid narrative had flipped entirely, exactly the way Priya predicted. It was less scandal, more modern fairy tale, several op-eds specifically praising my refusal to be embarrassed about accepting fair payment for a real job. My Instagram gained another 600,000 new followers in a single week. 3 studios that had previously passed on me for lead roles suddenly, urgently, wanted meetings. I told you, Priya said, practically singing it down the phone. This is the right kind of visibility. The engagement party itself was smaller than the wedding would eventually be. Just 80 guests, held on the rooftop of the Lowe's Angels house, string lights strung between the palm trees. A jazz trio Aiden had flown in from New Orleans because I'd mentioned once, in passing, weeks earlier, that jazz reminded me of my grandmother's kitchen on Sunday mornings. He'd remembered. Of course, he always remembered every detail about me. More than any single luxury gift he ever gave me was this habit that undid me most completely about this man. The way he collected small, ordinary details about my life like they were precious stones, and then, months later, handed them back to me transformed into something extraordinary. Halmoni flew in for the party alone, insisting Chairman Han handle the business, while she handled the important part, and spent the entire evening holding court by the bar, telling increasingly elaborate stories about Aiden's childhood to anyone who would listen, most of them, according to Aiden's mortified whispered commentary, at least 60% exaggerated. She's telling them about the motorcycle again, isn't she? He muttered, watching his grandmother gesture wildly to a cluster of delighted guests. She's telling them, you rode it into the ocean. I did not ride it into the ocean. She says you did. She's very committed to the ocean detail. My grandmother, he said, pulling me close, resting his chin on top of my head as we watched Halmoni act out what was apparently a very dramatic ocean rescue with her cocktail napkin, has decided that the true story of my life is significantly less interesting than the one she's inventing in real time. I've stopped correcting her. It only encourages her. I love her, I said honestly. I love your whole impossible family. They love you considerably more, he said, which, given how difficult my father can be, is either a testament to your charm or a sign that you've secretly bribed everyone involved. Can it be both? With you, he said, kissing my temple, it's usually both. We got married 4 months later, exactly on schedule, on the cliffs of the Santorini villa where he'd once carried his own wine down a narrow path just to be alone with me. I wore a wedding dress that I fell in love with the moment I set my eyes on it, and a veil made of lace so fine it looked like I was floating in mid-motion. My hair, natural and unbothered, fell in loose curls down my back, exactly the way it had that very first gala night, because Aiden had once again told the stylist, without a hint of negotiation, I like her hair free and natural. 212 guests flew in from 4 continents. Halmoni sat in the front row in a hanbok the color of good luck, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief, and loudly informing anyone within earshot, in 2 languages, that she had personally selected me the moment she met me, and everyone else had simply been slow to catch up. My mother sat beside her, the 2 of them thick as thieves after 4 months of increasingly elaborate transatlantic phone calls comparing recipes, and apparently plotting the exact color scheme of my bridal shower without consulting me once. Elijah, freshly graduated, stood as my man of honor in a cream suit Aiden had personally tailored for him, looking prouder than I'd ever seen him. Chairman Han walked me the final few steps to where Aiden waited, which nobody had planned, which nobody had asked him to do, and which made my mother cry so hard Halmoni had to hand her a second handkerchief. "Your father should be here for this," he said quietly, before he let go of my arm. "Since he is not, I would like to stand in, if you'll permit an old man the honor." "I'd like that very much," I told him, and meant it more than I expected to. Aiden was waiting at the end of the aisle in a black suit that fit him like it had been poured on, jaw tight with the particular emotion of a man who had spent his entire life being told exactly what to feel, and exactly when, finally, standing somewhere he'd chosen entirely for himself. When I reached him, he leaned down and murmured in my ear, "You once told me that I couldn't buy you to make you stay." "I remember," I murmured. "You were right." His eyes were suspiciously bright. "So I didn't buy it. I earned it, every single day for the last year. I intend to keep earning it for the rest of my life." "That," I whispered, "is the most romantic thing I've ever heard in a wedding." I tried to tease him, but he went ahead and kissed me before the officiant had even finished the first line, which made the guests giggle in approval. The reception spilled out along the cliffside under strings of warm gold light, the Aegean dark and glittering below us, and somewhere around midnight, after my mother had taught half of Aiden's cousins an electric slide none of them had ever encountered, and Halmoni had beaten 3 separate board members at a drinking game whose rules she refused to explain. Elijah stood up with a glass of champagne he'd clearly had one too many of, tapped a fork against it with more enthusiasm than precision, and announced he had a toast. "So my sister," he began, swaying slightly, grinning at me across the table, "used to tell me when we were kids sharing one bedroom in Inglewood that one day she was going to be so successful I'd never have to worry about anything again. I thought she meant like a nice apartment, maybe a car that starts on the first try." He raised his glass higher. "Instead, she went and married a literal prince of industry who flew our whole family to Korea on a private jet with a bedroom in it." A whole bedroom. I don't even know how to process that this is someone's normal life. Laughter rippled through the guests. I even heard Aiden chuckle beside me. "But real talk," Elijah continued. He looked at Aiden directly now, with a serious expression under the champagne-loose grin. "Man, I don't care how much money you've got. What matters to me is that my sister has worked really hard to be where she is today, and you really love her for who she is. So, here," to Aiden and Athena, "building a life full of happiness and love for each other." The whole reception rose in a toast, glasses catching the string lights, and I found Aiden's hand under the table, threading our fingers together. Before I could react, Aiden pulled me away from the party entirely, down the same narrow cliff path from our first trip here, to the same private cove. "You're going to ruin my dress," I told him, already kicking off my heels. "I have a great deal of money," he said, pulling me down onto the sand beside him, moonlight silvering the sharp line of his jaw exactly the way it had a year ago. "I'll buy you another dress. I'll buy you 1,000 dresses if you want them. That is, in fact, one of the only advantages of marrying an obscenely wealthy man, and I expect you to take full advantage of it for the rest of your life." "Careful," I said, curling into his side, the sound of the waves folding soft and steady beneath the distant music. "Or I might start coming up with brilliant ideas on how to spend your money." "I expect nothing less, my love." He laughed and kissed me, slowly under the same stars that had watched us fall for each other a year earlier, with absolutely no cameras, no contracts, no boardrooms, no fathers left to convince. Just the two of us, married now, wine-stained and sand-covered and completely, thoroughly happy. Later that night, back in the villa, he peeled the ruined hem of my wedding dress off my shoulders with the same reverence he'd shown that very first night in Lowe's Angels, and reminded me, in a great deal of very thorough, very satisfying detail, exactly why I had said yes to every single outrageous thing this wonderful sweet man had ever asked of me. We didn't take a conventional honeymoon right after the wedding. Aiden had a shareholder meeting he couldn't reschedule twice, and I had reshoots on the film I'd nearly missed the table read for entirely. But 3 weeks later, he showed up at the house with no warning, 2 packed suitcases already waiting by the door. and the particular satisfied expression of a man who had planned something and had no intention of explaining it in advance. Where are we going? Paris. Aiden, I have a fitting tomorrow. Cancelled, rescheduled, handled. He kissed my forehead like this settled the matter entirely, which, infuriatingly, it did. You mentioned once, on our very first dinner, that you'd always wanted to see the Musée d'Orsay in person instead of just in textbooks. I've been keeping a list. I see, you've been keeping a long list. Several lists, actually. I'm a very thorough man. We boarded the private jet again, his hand warm over mine the entire flight, while he read something in Korean, and I fell asleep against his shoulder somewhere over Greenland. We landed to golden Parisian light slanting low across the Seine, checked into a suite overlooking the river with a view so absurd I genuinely laughed out loud the first time I saw it, and spent 4 days doing exactly what he'd promised. Museums in the morning, wine in the afternoon, long unhurried dinners that stretched past midnight because neither of us had anywhere else in the world we wanted to be. At the Musée d'Orsay, he stood beside me in front of a degas for 20 full minutes without checking his phone once, listening while I explained, entirely unprompted, everything I remembered from an art history class I'd taken purely as an elective a decade earlier. And when I finally ran out of things to say, embarrassed by how much I'd rambled, he just looked at me with an adorable expression that had so much effect on me that it stole the rest of my sentence entirely. What? I asked. Nothing. I just like watching you get excited about something that has nothing to do with me. He tucked a curl behind my ear. It's my favorite version of you. Right up there with the market stall and the wrap party. You have a lot of favorite versions of me. Well, I intend to spend the rest of my life collecting more. On our last night, he took me to a tiny restaurant on the left bank with exactly 9 tables. No sign, no reservation system anyone outside a very specific circle seemed to know about. The kind of place that existed entirely on word of mouth and the sheer stubbornness of an 80-year-old chef who cooked exactly what he felt like cooking and nothing else. No opera tonight, I noted, halfway through the second course, remembering the elaborate fundraiser events that had once defined our public appearances together. No opera, he agreed. Just us. I've decided I prefer this. The Billionaire prefers a 9-table restaurant with no sign over an actual opera house. The Billionaire, he corrected, refilling my wine, prefers anywhere you happen to be sitting across from him. The opera houses were never the point, Athena. You were always the point. I simply didn't figure out how to say it earlier without it sounding like a business proposal when we met. I see. You've gotten considerably better at this romance thing since that night at the hillside. I had excellent motivation. Later, back in the suite, with the Eiffel Tower glittering gold and distant through the window, we made love all night. And Aiden showed me in slow, wonderful strokes how he had really improved his romantic instincts and putting my desires above his. I want to be clear about something before I close this story out. Everything that happened after that night by the hillside, the private jets, the diamonds, the villa in Santorini, the ring that still occasionally catches me off guard when it flashes under kitchen lights while I'm making coffee, none of it replaced the career I'd spent a decade building before I ever met Aiden Minjun. If anything, it sharpened it. The film I'd nearly missed the table read for, the one Priya had fought so hard to keep on schedule through an international scandal and a surprise engagement, open to the best reviews of my career. 6 months after the wedding, I stood on a stage I had imagined standing on since I was 9 years old, doing homework on the floor of my mother's garage salon, and heard my own name, Athena Tucker, read aloud for a Best Supporting Actress nomination. I did not win. I want to be honest about that too, because fairy tales, in my experience, don't actually require every single thing to go perfectly to still count as a fairy tale. But I sat in that audience in a designer dress that was made specially for me, with Aiden's hand wrapped tight around mine, and when the winner's name was called and it wasn't mine, he leaned over before I could even arrange my face into the practiced, gracious smile I'd rehearsed for exactly this outcome, and murmured against my ear, "You already won the only category that matters to me. Everyone in this room knows it. Watch their faces when we walk out." He was right, annoyingly, as he so often was. The applause when we left that theater had very little to do with the actual outcome of the evening, and everything to do with 2 years of tabloid headlines finally, publicly, resolving into something the whole world had apparently been rooting for without my permission. Next year, Priya told me backstage, already scrolling through 3 new script offers on her phone, practically vibrating with the specific energy of an agent who smelled a career about to detonate into an entirely new stratosphere. Next year, you will not just be nominated. You understand that, right? This changes everything. It already changed everything, I told her, watching Aiden across the room, deep in an entirely unnecessary conversation with my director about supply chains again, laughing at something that had clearly nothing to do with either of their actual jobs. The night I met my husband changed everything. This is just everybody else catching up. My mother closed her salon's doors for good exactly 1 year after the wedding, not because business had failed, but because business had finally, gloriously succeeded. She sold the salon for enough money to retire entirely, at 53, to a house 40 minutes from ours with a garden she'd been dreaming about since before I was born. Elijah finished his nursing program with honors, and, in a twist none of us saw coming, took a position at a hospital 2 blocks from the Hanmin Foundation's newest community health initiative. One Aiden had funded specifically, quietly, without ever mentioning it to me until Elijah called, breathless, to say he'd gotten the job. You didn't have to do that, I told him that night, curled against his side on the terrace where it had all started. I didn't do it for you, he said. I did it because your brother is one of the most promising nursing students that hospitals ever recruited, and it happened to also be the right thing to do. The fact that it makes you cry happy tears in my lap is simply an excellent side effect. You're a terrible liar. I'm an excellent liar, he corrected, kissing my temple. I've simply decided I have no interest in lying to you. 1 year later. People still ask me, sometimes, at movie premieres, at galas, in the increasingly frequent interviews where I get to talk about my own films instead of my husband's net worth, whether I regret how it all started. Whether being paid $300,000 to pretend to love a man for 10 days is a strange, uncomfortable footnote in an otherwise fairy tale ending. I always tell them the truth, because I promised you, dear friend, from the very first page, that I would always be honest. I tell them that the money doesn't amount to anything compared to the wonderful experience I've had since the first day I agreed to be with Aiden. Sometimes, when the house is quiet and Aiden's still catching up on calls from Seoul in his study, and I'm curled up on the terrace with a script I'm considering, I think back to that girl on the hillside. She was furious, stranded, and absolutely certain her night couldn't get any worse. I wish I could tell her to relax. I wish I could tell her that the declined card, the abandoned rideshare, the whole humiliating mess of it, was about to become the best story she'd ever have to tell. But I don't think she'd have believed me. I'm not sure I believe it myself some mornings, waking up in a bed I still can't quite believe is mine, next to a man who looks at me now exactly the way he looked at me that very first night. Like I'm the most interesting thing he's ever stumbled onto in a life that had, before me, already had absolutely everything. Halmoni still calls every Sunday, without fail, mostly to ask when we're giving her great-grandchildren and to report, in exhaustive detail, on whichever board member she's currently terrorizing. My mother and chairman hand visit sometimes. Elijah was most times very busy, although he mentioned in his last visit that he'd found a girl he loved, and will introduce her to me someday, when he's ready. That very night, back at the house in Los Angeles, Aiden made sure that my name was on the deed right alongside his. He pulled me out onto the terrace, city lights spread gold beneath us, and pressed a kiss to my temple. Tell me, do you have any regrets? He asked, about how our love story started and how it's been going so far. I thought again, about the first night it all started, the declined card, the abandoned rideshare, the 6-inch heels and the bag of chips I'd been eating out of pure spite when the most devastatingly handsome man I'd ever seen rolled to a stop beside me and asked if I needed a ride. And then I thought about my life now, and how it's been glorious with every moment I'd spent with him. I've got zero regret, honey, I said slowly, and meant it completely. In fact, I will do it all over again if the need arises. He showed me how much he loved me, right there. The end. If you enjoyed this love story, like, subscribe, and drop a comment telling me your team and where in the world you're watching from. I will personally reply to every single comment in the first hour. See you in the next story. Bye for now.